In the heart of 5th century Athens, a name that dared to challenge the very pillars of power and knowledge, Socrates, with his famous Socratic Method, shattered conventions and forced even the most powerful to question their beliefs. But this bold pursuit of truth came with a price. Accused of corrupting the youth and impiety, Socrates stood trial, facing a death sentence for his firm commitment to philosophy. His refusal to compromise his beliefs led to his execution. But his legacy lives on, an eternal reminder of the power of integrity and the relentless pursuit of truth. What power this man held. Let's find out if you stay with us till the end. Socrates' story is a timeless lesson. What would you stand for, even in the face of death? Who was Socrates? The name that lingers in the Western philosophy with questions, Socrates. Picture this, Athens, 399 BC. A man standing the trial that would later change the course of history. His crime, corrupting the youth and defying the gods of his time, and all these questions that appear in your mind, he laid foundation of that. His fate, death. But who was Socrates, really? A philosopher? A threat to society? Or a man misunderstood by his time? Born around 470 BC, Socrates is hailed as the father of Western philosophy, a title as grand as it is puzzling. Why? Because Socrates wrote nothing down. His thoughts, his words, even his essence are known only through others, mainly his pupils, Plato and Xenophon. Yet their accounts couldn't be more different. Socrates, his name echoes through history as one of the most influential thinkers to ever live. Yet, behind the well-known teachings of the unexamined life and ignorance as wisdom, there lies a far darker and more controversial truth. Born in 469 BCE in Athens, Socrates wasn't just a philosopher. He was a thorn in the side of Athenian society. His method of questioning, his constant pursuit of truth, left those in power uneasy, especially the wealthy and influential men of Athens. Why? Because Socrates didn't just seek knowledge, he tore down their beliefs, exposing contradictions and causing discomfort. And the more he questioned, the more he became seen as a threat to the very foundations of Athenian democracy. Despite his intellectual prowess, Socrates was far from a traditional hero. Imagine a man, ugly by the standards of Athenian society, whose looks were constantly mocked. With bulging eyes, a snub nose, and a potbelly, Socrates was the exact opposite of what ancient Greeks admired. His physical appearance became a subject of ridicule in plays and jokes. He didn't wear fine clothes or present himself as an idealized figure. Instead, he wore the same cloak and sandals daily. And yet, despite these features, he commanded attention, forcing even the richest, most influential men of Athens to listen to him, question after question, until they were left with no answers. What makes Socrates even more fascinating and frustrating to history is that he left behind no written record of his philosophy. Everything we know of him comes from the writings of his students, most notably Plato. But how much of what we know is truly Socrates' voice? The mystery only deepens as we realize that Socrates didn't want to be immortalized in writing. His teachings were lived, not inscribed. He believed that knowledge must be dynamic, gained through questioning, interaction, and dialogue. But could his reluctance to write down his ideas have been the very thing that made him so dangerous? His words, never committed to paper, lived and shifted in the minds of those around him. Socrates was no stranger to battle. In fact, he fought valiantly in several key battles during the Peloponnesian War, including Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. But here's where things get interesting. His military service wasn't just about defending Athens, it was about his loyalty. At the Battle of Potidaea, he saved the life of Alcibiades, a notorious Athenian general. But Alcibiades, like many of Socrates' associates, became a figure who sympathized with the Spartan cause, Athens' enemy. And as Athens faced defeat after defeat, Socrates' association with these men started to look increasingly suspicious. Between 431 and 404 BCE, Athens was embroiled in the devastating Peloponnesian War. The city was divided, its democracy fractured. Some of Socrates' closest associates were not just aristocrats, they were pro-Spartan, believing in a more rigid, oligarchic rule. Among them, Alcibiades, Socrates' friend and protege, was seen as a traitor by the democratic factions of Athens. And when the statues of Hermes were destroyed, an event that rattled Athenian society, Socrates' name began to surface alongside the conspirators. Was Socrates a mere bystander? Or was he, too, a part of the underground political currents that sought to challenge Athens' democracy? His praise of Sparta in Plato's writings only fueled suspicions. In the 19th century, philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher tore apart Xenophon's portrayal, calling it naive and uninspired. Because Plato paints Socrates as a cunning thinker, a man whose Socratic method, a style of questioning, could dismantle any argument. But Xenophon, he portrays a duller, more pragmatic man, focused on self-control and patriotism rather than philosophical wit. Xenophon, he argued, was no philosopher, but a soldier seeking to vindicate his friend. Modern scholars like Charles H. Kahn have only deepened the mystery, suggesting that Plato's Apology might be the only reliable source on Socrates. Yet even that is shrouded in doubt. What was the crime he committed? In 399 BC, Socrates, known for his unparalleled wisdom and philosophical prowess, stood accused of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens, and worse still, for asabeia, impiety, or failing to worship the gods of the city and instead worshiping false deities. The charges were grave, the stakes were high, yet Socrates, ever unflinching, defended himself, a man unwavering in his beliefs. But despite his impassioned defense, the verdict was inevitable. He was found guilty, his fate sealed by a majority vote of the Athenian jury. Hundreds of men entrusted with determining whether the philosopher would live or die. Yet in a move that defied expectations, Socrates did not beg for mercy. He proposed his own punishment, a seemingly bizarre suggestion: free food and housing from the state, as a reward for the service he had given to Athens. Alternatively, he offered a fine, 1 mina of silver, the sum he claimed to possess. But his proposal was rejected. The Athenian jurors declined his humble request, ordering instead a punishment that would mark his place in history forever: the death penalty. The backdrop of this trial was anything but ordinary. Athens was a city in turmoil. Just 5 years earlier, in 404 BC, the Athenians had suffered a devastating loss to the Spartans at the Battle of Aegospotami, a crushing naval defeat that shattered their once mighty empire. Soon after, the Spartans imposed a new government, the 30 tyrants, oligarchs who ruled with ruthless power. Athens, broken and divided, was left in the aftermath of this chaos, a people struggling to regain their sense of identity. This was the world Socrates faced. Socrates found himself accused during this volatile period, where political factions waged war for control and democratic ideals were under siege. A period where the city's soul seemed to hang in the balance. In the wake of this tyranny, Athenians began to rise against the oligarchs, briefly reclaiming the government before the Spartans intervened once more. The struggle for freedom had torn the city apart. But what of the accusations themselves? Meletus, a poet, was the primary instigator of the charges against Socrates, calling for his execution on grounds of impiety. Alongside him were Anytus and Lycon, men whose names would go down in history not for their wisdom, but for their role in condemning a great philosopher. Socrates' crime, as his accusers claimed, was twofold. He rejected the anthropomorphic gods of Athens, the gods whose tempers mirrored those of men, acting out of jealousy, spite, and pettiness. Socrates denied such qualities in the divine. In his view, the gods were wiser, more rational, beyond the flaws of mere mortals. Furthermore, he believed in a divine daimonion, an inner voice that guided him, a voice his accusers decried as evidence of his impiety. In Plato's Apology, Socrates lays bare his defense. "I am no atheist," he declares. "How could I be? I worship the gods in my own way." Yet the paradox of his defense is undeniable. If he worshipped false gods, how could he be accused of atheism? It was this very contradiction that he seized upon, arguing that impiety and atheism could not coexist. His logic, though compelling, did not sway the jurors. Socrates' response was defiant. He claimed he was God's gift to Athens. His work, his questioning, his relentless pursuit of wisdom had served to improve the city. "By condemning me," he warned the jury, "you will harm only yourselves." His words, sharp as arrows, pierced the air, but they fell on deaf ears. Athens was too afraid of change, too entrenched in its ways, to see the truth in his words. The trial was over. The verdict was clear. Socrates was to face the ultimate penalty, the death sentence. The hemlock was ready, the poison that would silence his voice forever. On the final day of his life, Socrates was visited by his friends. They pleaded with him to escape, to flee Athens and save his life. But Socrates, ever the philosopher, declined. He did not fear death. To him, life and death were but different parts of the same journey. "An unjust life is worse than an unjust death," he declared. As his friends gathered around, Socrates, in his final moments, imparted his thoughts on virtue, knowledge, and the soul. In his death, he had become the symbol of the ultimate quest for truth, the price one pays for challenging the status quo. And though his body would perish, the legacy of Socrates, his method, his philosophy, his defiance, would live on, forever etched in the history of thought. The man who knew, or he knew nothing. Socrates was not a teacher in the conventional sense. He didn't lecture, he didn't preach, he simply questioned. His method, the Socratic Method, was one of relentless inquiry, an unyielding pursuit of truth through dialogue. His tool, the simplest yet most profound question of all: what is it? Whether it was virtue, justice, or courage, Socrates engaged his interlocutors in a game of intellectual tug-of-war. At first, they would define these concepts with confidence until the questioning began. With each answer, Socrates would reveal contradictions, exposing how little they truly understood. But it wasn't just about showing others their ignorance. Socrates, the man who famously declared that he knew nothing, also knew something incredibly important, that acknowledging one's ignorance was the first step to true wisdom. He didn't claim to have the answers. Instead, he embodied the ancient aphorism, "Know thyself," and through that self-awareness, he sought truth, not as a teacher, but as a seeker, just like his students. They were all, together, searching. But the Socratic Method wasn't just for others. Socrates himself was constantly testing his own beliefs, probing his own understanding of the world. He would sit in discussion with his students, questioning his own views on virtue, knowledge, and even morality. Socrates didn't teach answers. He revealed the questions that no one dared to ask. Through his elenchus, his method of relentless refutation, Socrates left no stone unturned. Yet, for all his wisdom, Socrates' method was controversial. Scholars have debated the very essence of his approach. Was he trying to uncover the truth, or merely expose the inconsistencies in people's beliefs? Some saw it as a path to wisdom, others as a path to chaos. Did Socrates truly seek the truth, or was his only goal to prove that no one truly knew anything? Perhaps the most striking feature of Socrates' philosophy was his Socratic ignorance. He claimed to know nothing, but this was no simple claim. His famous words, "I know that I know nothing," were not a sign of weakness, but of strength. He had no grand knowledge to offer. Instead, he gave humanity something far more profound, the gift of intellectual humility. And through this humility, Socrates revealed something extraordinary, that the pursuit of wisdom requires first the understanding of our own limitations. Yet, despite his claimed ignorance, Socrates' irony, his ability to feign ignorance, became legendary. Was he truly unaware, or was it all part of a grand design? To entice others into the search for wisdom, he pretended not to know, forcing those around him to question their own understanding of the world. This Socratic irony was his weapon, his silent, subtle way of showing that knowledge is not merely about accumulating facts, but about understanding the very nature of wisdom itself. Socrates' philosophical legacy doesn't end with his dialogues or his methods. His influence echoes across time. From Aristotle's critiques to the Stoics' ethical doctrines, Socrates shaped the very foundations of Western thought. His teachings transcended his lifetime, inspiring philosophers who would define the very nature of knowledge, virtue, and happiness. The Socratic legacy, the relentless pursuit of truth, the quest for self-knowledge, and the humility to admit one's own ignorance, would guide the intellectual journey for centuries to come. And yet, the question remains, did Socrates ever truly answer the most important question of all? What is the purpose of life? Some say that Socrates never answered that question, and perhaps that was his greatest lesson. By questioning everything, he revealed that the pursuit of knowledge, the search for truth itself, is what gives life meaning. And so, in his final words, Socrates did not offer an answer, but a challenge to seek, to question, and to never stop learning. Are you ready to question everything? Mystery Media brings you gripping, thought-provoking content that delves into untold tales of courage, wisdom, and rebellion. Subscribe now and continue the journey of intellectual discovery.